Some ancient legends sound so ridiculous they should have stayed in the campfire story pile. Except archaeologists went digging and found out people were not exaggerating nearly enough. In this video, we are looking at 32 weird ancient legends that turned out to have real evidence behind them. From drowned cities and tiny humans to cursed tombs, lost empires, and disasters. People remembered as myths. 1. King Midas of Phrygia is supposed to be the guy who could turn everything into gold with one touch, which sounds amazing right up until you remember that food also counts. For ages, he lived in that awkward zone between fairy tale and real ruler. Then archaeologists opened a giant burial mound at Gordion in modern Turkey and found a royal tomb from the 8th century BCE that likely belonged to Midas himself, or at least someone very close to him, possibly his father. And here's the beautiful part. There was no gold in it. None. Zero. The man history remembers as the human version of a jewelry store was buried with bronze vessels, elegant wooden furniture, and leftovers from a lavish funeral banquet that included lamb, lentils, and a spicy alcoholic drink. So either the Golden Touch story was later myth-making, or ancient mourners had a truly savage sense of irony. 2. Hindu tradition speaks of Dvaraka, the glorious city linked to Krishna, a place so important it ended up swallowed by the sea after his death. For a long time, that sounded like exactly the kind of epic tale civilizations create when they want to explain a vanished golden age. Then marine archaeologists started exploring the waters off Gujarat and found something inconvenient for the skeptics. Submerged walls, anchors, stone structures, and other traces of a real settlement lying under the Arabian Sea near the location associated with the legend. The dating is still argued over because archaeology loves a good argument almost as much as academia loves footnotes. But the big point remains. There really was an underwater city in the very place the old stories described. Whether it was Krishna's actual capital or the ancient inspiration behind the myth, the drowned city part was not just poetic drama. 3. When the Maya world began unraveling around 900 CE, people threw out all the usual explanations. Warfare, invasions, political chaos, elite infighting, the standard historical misery package. But Maya traditions also spoke in the language of divine punishment, as if the heavens themselves had turned hostile. Then scientists checked stalagmites from caves, because apparently rocks can keep better weather records than human civilization. Layer by layer, those mineral formations revealed the real nightmare, a series of extreme droughts that hammered the Maya heartland for decades. Rainfall dropped by as much as 70% during key periods, which is catastrophic when your cities depend on seasonal agriculture and reliable water. The gods were not hurling lightning bolts. The sky just stopped cooperating. Their legends about anger from above were not foolish superstition. They were people trying to explain an environmental collapse so brutal it looked supernatural. 4. The Quran mentions Iram of the Pillars, a proud and wealthy city destroyed for its arrogance and then lost beneath the sands, which sounds exactly like the kind of warning tale parents tell when a civilization gets too full of itself. For centuries, people linked that story to Ubar, the so-called Atlantis of the Sands. But no one could actually point to it on a map without sounding a little dramatic. Then satellite imagery, including work tied to NASA data, revealed ancient caravan routes in Oman all converging on one lonely spot in the desert. Excavations there uncovered a settlement tied to the frankincense trade, and the place had partly collapsed into a limestone cavity under the ground. So yes, the city was quite literally swallowed. Not by divine symbolism, not by metaphor, by geology. Sometimes the desert does not just bury your city. Sometimes the floor opens up and takes it personally. 5. On Flores Island in Indonesia, local traditions told of the Ebu Gogo, small hairy people who lived in caves, stole food, and babbled in odd voices. Outsiders heard that and did what outsiders do best. Smiled politely, wrote down colorful folklore, and moved on. Then in 2003, archaeologists found the remains of Homo floresiensis on that exact island, a tiny human species about 3 feet tall that survived until surprisingly recent prehistory. Suddenly, the whole little cave dweller story stopped sounding cute and started sounding like memory. These were not random fantasy creatures. They may have been cultural echoes of real beings that coexisted with modern humans long enough to get locked into oral tradition. In other words, the islanders were not inventing magical cave people for entertainment. They were possibly remembering neighbors, which is a strong reminder that when locals describe weird little people in the hills, maybe do not instantly file it under adorable nonsense. 6. Aztec legends talked about warriors bringing the scream of the dead into battle, and historians naturally assumed this was just poetic intimidation, because ancient armies loved sounding terrifying on paper. Then archaeologists began finding strange clay whistles in Mexican burial sites, many of them shaped like skulls, which was already not encouraging. The real fun started when someone blew into one. Instead of a neat musical note, the whistle produced a sound disturbingly close to a human scream in full panic. Not a cheerful festival noise, not a pleasant battlefield flute. More like the exact soundtrack your brain would choose for impending doom. Now imagine ranks of warriors charging while hundreds of those things howl at once. That is not symbolism. That is acoustic psychological warfare from people who clearly understood that fear could be weaponized just as effectively as obsidian blades. 7. Viking sagas mention sunstones, mysterious crystals that could help sailors locate the sun, even when clouds or fog hid it completely, which sounded, admittedly, like classic saga material, halfway between practical seamanship and something a wizard would hand you before a side quest. Then scientists started studying Icelandic spar, a clear calcite crystal that polarizes light in a very useful way. Rotate it toward the sky and the optical effect shifts according to the sun's hidden position, even when the sun itself is invisible. So yes, the thing actually works. On the cloudy North Atlantic, that would have been incredibly useful for navigation. A similar crystal was even found in an Elizabethan shipwreck, suggesting the method may have lasted for centuries. The magical Viking stone was not fantasy after all. It was an accidental optics lesson discovered by people who had no modern physics, but did have places to be. 8. Herodotus claimed that Scythian warriors decorated their bodies with elaborate tattoos of animals and mythical creatures, and later readers treated that the way people often treat Herodotus, with a respectful nod followed by quiet suspicion. Then Siberian permafrost decided to settle the argument. Frozen mummies recovered from the Pazyryk burial mounds emerged with skin preserved well enough to reveal stunning tattoos across their arms, legs, torsos, and shoulders. Deer, griffins, fish, swirling patterns, all done with real sophistication, not crude doodles scratched in by bored nomads. These designs were full-on body art from over 2,000 years ago. So Herodotus was not inventing barbarian fashion to spice up his book. He was describing what he had seen. The dead themselves eventually backed him up, which is one of the strongest possible historical endorsements, especially when the evidence is literally written on their skin. 9. Ancient writers said Caligula built enormous floating pleasure palaces on Lake Nemi, complete with luxury fittings, marble, and enough extravagance to make even Rome pause and say, "That seems a bit much." For centuries, people assumed this was exaggerated gossip about an emperor, famous for treating reality like a personal dare. Then Mussolini drained the lake in the 1920s, because apparently fascist vanity projects occasionally stumble into useful archaeology. Out of the mud came 2 giant ships, each more than 200 feet long. They had mosaic floors, bronze fittings, plumbing systems, and bath facilities. In other words, Caligula really had built floating mansions for leisure, because ordinary decadence was clearly too boring. Ancient rumor had not overdone the story. If anything, it had undersold the absurdity. The ships were later destroyed during World War II, which is tragic, but enough had been documented to confirm that Roman excess was somehow even sillier than the gossip suggested. 10. Chinese tradition credits Emperor Yu with taming a catastrophic flood and laying the foundations for civilization, which for a long time sounded like textbook myth-making. Hero appears, Nature goes wild. Hero beats chaos. Dynasty gets a clean origin story. Very convenient. Then geologists found evidence of a real disaster near Jishi Gorge on the Yellow River. Around 1920 BCE, an earthquake triggered a massive landslide that dammed the river. When that natural barrier finally gave way, it unleashed one of the biggest floods known in early human history. The timing lines up uncannily well with the old traditions. The scale matches too. So while Emperor Yu himself may be partly legendary, the catastrophe attached to his name almost certainly was not. The story seems to preserve a memory of a real event so traumatic it reshaped communities, politics, and probably every conversation that started with, "You think today's river looks bad?" 11. According to traditional Chinese history, the Shang dynasty ruled from roughly 1600 to 1046 BCE. The problem was that for a long time, historians had no solid archaeological proof it existed, which made the whole dynasty look a little uncomfortably legendary. Then farmers started digging up strange animal bones and turtle shells covered in ancient writing. These turned out to be oracle bones, used in divination by heating them until they cracked and then interpreting the results. Very practical, very dramatic, very Shang. But the real jackpot was in the inscriptions themselves. They recorded royal names and genealogies that matched traditional king lists with startling accuracy. Suddenly, the semi-mythical dynasty had left behind thousands of written records confirming its rulers and rituals. The Shang did not just exist. They wrote things down, asked ancestors questions, and accidentally left historians the greatest told-you-so package imaginable. 12. Spanish conquistadors spent decades hunting El Dorado, the legendary city of gold, driven by the kind of greed that makes common sense pack its bags and leave the building. The problem was that they had misunderstood the legend from the start. El Dorado was not originally a city at all. It was a person. Among the Muisca of present-day Colombia, a new ruler took part in a ceremony where his body was covered in gold dust before he went out onto Lake Guatavita and washed it off as an offering. In 1969, archaeologists found a golden raft showing exactly that ritual, with the central figure surrounded by attendants. So the ceremony was real. The Spaniards had simply turned one glitter-covered man into a fantasy about infinite golden kingdoms. Classic colonial overreaction. They were chasing a mistranslation across a continent while the actual meaning had been sitting there all along, shimmering politely and trying not to laugh. 13. The Hebrew Bible describes the Assyrian siege of Lachish in 701 BCE, when King Sennacherib crushed one of Judah's major fortress cities. On its own, that could be dismissed as a religious narrative shaped by ideology, because ancient texts were not exactly allergic to spin. But then archaeology produced a rare historical triple match. First, reliefs discovered in Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh show the siege in grisly detail, with Assyrian troops attacking the city, prisoners marched away, and captives being impaled for that extra imperial charm. Second, excavations at Lachish uncovered destruction layers from the same period, including arrowheads, sling stones, and the remains of a huge Assyrian siege ramp. The physical evidence, the Assyrian propaganda, and the biblical account all describe the same event. When enemies and victims agree on the basics and the ground itself joins the conversation, you are no longer in legend territory. 14. Greek writers told stories about Amazons, warrior women who rode, hunted, and fought like absolute nightmares for any man who thought ancient warfare was an all-boys club. For a long time, scholars treated them as fantasy born from male anxiety, which is a very academic way of saying, surely the Greeks were being dramatic again. Then burial mounds across the Eurasian steppe started giving up the bodies of real women buried with bows, spears, swords, and daggers. Not decorative weapons either. Some of these women showed combat injuries that had healed, meaning they had survived actual battles. Others had leg bones shaped by years of horseback riding. These were fighters, not ceremonial princesses staged for the afterlife. So the Amazon legend was not just a myth about gender panic, It was likely rooted in real steppe cultures where women could and did fight. Herodotus, against all odds, once again ended up looking annoyingly correct. 15. Sodom and Gomorrah are usually treated as classic moral warning stories, complete with fire from heaven, divine judgment, and enough drama to make subtlety give up entirely. Then, excavations at Tal el-Hammam in Jordan revealed evidence of a Bronze Age city violently destroyed around 1650 BCE in a way that was anything but normal. Pottery had been exposed to immense heat. Human remains were scattered in patterns consistent with a sudden catastrophic blast. The surrounding soil showed unusual levels of salt and sulfur. One leading explanation is an airburst, something like a meteor or comet fragment, exploding in the atmosphere with terrifying force. That would have produced temperatures intense enough to vaporize materials and blast debris across the area, while also salting the land and ruining agriculture for generations. So, fire from heaven may not have been poetic exaggeration at all. It may have been eyewitness memory filtered through ancient language. 16. The Bible mentions the Hittites often enough that, for centuries, skeptics use their apparent absence from archaeology as a handy argument against biblical reliability. No extra-biblical Hittite empire, no reason to trust the text, case closed. Then archaeologists excavated Hattusa in modern Turkey and found an enormous capital city packed with fortifications, temples, palaces, and tens of thousands of clay tablets. Oops. The Hittites were not some tiny tribal footnote accidentally inflated by scripture. They were a major power that rivaled Egypt, negotiated treaties, fought big wars, and played serious diplomatic games across the ancient Near East. Their civilization had simply vanished from memory so thoroughly that the Bible preserved their name when much of the wider record had gone quiet. One moment they were treated like fiction. The next moment, they were one of archaeology's biggest comeback stories. It was an embarrassing day for anyone too confident in the phrase, "they never existed." 17. Herodotus described a tunnel on the island of Samos that had been cut through a mountain from both ends at once, with the two teams meeting in the middle. To later readers, that sounded suspiciously like ancient bragging dressed up as engineering. After all, how were 6th century BCE workers supposed to line up two tunnels through solid rock without laser levels, GPS, or someone yelling from the other side with a very long rope? Then, archaeologists uncovered the tunnel of Eupalinos, and the answer became deeply inconvenient for the skeptics. The tunnel is real, more than a kilometer long, and the two excavation teams met with surprisingly minor adjustments. However they managed it, using geometry, measurement, acoustics, or sheer stubborn genius, they pulled it off. So once again, Herodotus reported something people thought was impossible, and the mountain eventually had to admit he was telling the truth. 18. The Bible links King Solomon with vast wealth and huge quantities of metal, especially copper and bronze, which made Solomon's mines sound like exactly the kind of royal propaganda ancient rulers would absolutely commission about themselves. Then archaeologists working in the Timna Valley in southern Israel uncovered large-scale copper production dating to the 10th century BCE, right in the period traditionally associated with Solomon. These were not a few local pits where somebody and his cousin hacked at rocks on weekends. This was serious, organized extraction on an industrial scale for the ancient world. Enormous amounts of copper moved through the region, which means someone had the authority, labor, and logistics to run the operation. Whether Solomon himself looked exactly like the Bible presents him is still debated, but the idea of major wealth built on copper resources during that era is no fantasy. The legendary mines were grounded in something very real. 19. Hannibal crossing the Alps with elephants was never the controversial part. Everyone accepted that, because once a general drags elephants over mountains, the story tends to stick. The real obsession was where exactly he crossed. Historians spent centuries fighting over routes, passes, and topography with the kind of academic passion usually reserved for things nobody outside academia has heard of. Then a team of researchers decided to search for the least glamorous clue in military history: ancient animal droppings. And somehow, magnificently, it worked. At one likely route, they identified a large deposit of horse and elephant dung dating to around the right period. Which makes perfect sense. An army of tens of thousands of men and animals does not march through the Alps without leaving biological evidence everywhere. So after 2,000 years of argument, one of history's great military mysteries was narrowed down by fossilized poop. Truly, scholarship is a noble profession. 20. The Minotaur myth gives us a monstrous, bull-headed creature trapped inside a maze beneath King Midas's palace on Crete, which sounds like the ancient world's answer to, what if architecture itself hated you? Then Arthur Evans excavated Knossos and uncovered a palatial complex so large and confusing that the labyrinth suddenly stopped sounding ridiculous. The place had hundreds upon hundreds of rooms, multiple levels, twisting corridors, staircases, storage areas, and a layout that could absolutely swallow a visitor with no map and no patience. To someone from a simpler settlement, Knossos would have felt less like a building and more like an elaborate prank. Add in Minoan bull symbolism and ritual imagery, and you have all the ingredients for a story about a beast in a maze. The Minotaur itself may belong to myth, but the physical inspiration behind the legend was very real and probably deeply disorienting after lunch. 21. Norse sagas say Leif Erikson sailed west from Greenland and reached a land called Vinland, where the climate seemed gentler and useful resources were available. For centuries, that was treated like campfire storytelling, charming and adventurous, but not exactly the sort of thing you put in a textbook with confidence. Then, in 1960, archaeologists found Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland, and suddenly the sagas started looking less like legend and more like family travel notes. The site contained unmistakably Norse features, including turf structures built in the Icelandic style, ironworking evidence, rivets, and artifacts consistent with Viking occupation. So yes, Norse explorers reached North America around the year 1000, roughly 5 centuries before Columbus. The old stories were not fantasy after all. They were memories preserved in saga form, which means medieval Scandinavians managed to discover America first, and then somehow failed at the whole publicity stage. 22. Sailors in northern waters told terrifying stories about the kraken, a sea beast so huge it could rise from the deep and pull ships under with its tentacles. Naturally, later observers labeled that maritime nonsense because sailors have a well-earned reputation for adding extra seasoning to every story. Then zoology showed up with giant squid and made everyone a lot less smug. These creatures are real, enormous, and deeply unpleasant to imagine meeting in the dark. They can reach lengths around 40 feet, have eyes the size of dinner plates, and leave circular scars on sperm whales during epic underwater fights. Their hooked tentacles and sharp beaks are very real equipment, not the product of overactive imagination. Could one drag down a full ship? Probably not. But could exhausted sailors encounter something massive and alien-looking in rough seas and decide they had just met an ocean demon? Absolutely. The kraken was exaggerated, sure, but not invented from nothing. 23. For a very long time, Homer's Iliad sat in that awkward category where everyone admired it, but nobody wanted to bet actual archaeology on it. A vast war over Helen, heroes with divine backup, a wooden horse, all very cinematic, all suspiciously epic. Then Heinrich Schliemann, who had more obsession than formal archaeological restraint, went digging at Hisarlik in modern Turkey because he was convinced Troy had been real. People laughed at him until he found a city. Actually, he found several layers of cities stacked on top of each other, including one destroyed around the right general era for the traditional Trojan War. So Troy was not just poetic scenery, it was a real place with real walls and a violent history. Whether every Homeric detail happened exactly as sung is another question entirely, but Schliemann proved the poet was not inventing the setting out of thin air. Beneath the myth, there was stone. 24. Everyone knows the sword and the stone from Arthurian legend, but Tuscany went ahead and produced a real one, because apparently medieval Italy enjoyed making mythology look underprepared. In a chapel at Montesiepi, there is an actual sword driven into actual rock, associated with Saint Galgano, a knight who supposedly renounced violence in 1180 by plunging his weapon into stone as a symbolic farewell to warfare. That sounds suspiciously theatrical, which is exactly why modern testing matters. Analysis of the sword shows metal consistent with the 12th century, and the way it enters the rock does not show obvious signs of welding or later trickery. So someone really did jam a sword into stone more than 800 years ago. Whether that required a miracle, bizarre determination, or a very specific geological weakness is still open to debate. But yes, history somehow gave us a legitimate sword and stone situation before fantasy fully claimed the brand. 25. Pontius Pilate, the Roman official who ordered Jesus' execution, appeared for a long time mainly in Christian texts, which led some scholars to wonder whether he had been exaggerated, reshaped, or even invented for theological storytelling. Then in 1961, archaeologists excavating at Caesarea Maritima found a limestone block with a Latin inscription naming Pontius Pilatus and identifying him as prefect of Judea. That was a rough day for the maybe he was just literary theory. The stone had been reused in later construction because ancient builders loved recycling monuments the way people now reuse glass jars and claim it as a lifestyle choice. Still, the inscription confirmed the official's name, title, and location exactly where the Gospels place him. So Pilate moved from being a figure known mainly through scripture into clear Roman administrative history. Sometimes one chunk of carved stone is all it takes to end a very long argument. 26. Suetonius claimed Nero's golden house featured a dining room that rotated constantly, day and night, imitating the movement of the heavens. Which sounds less like architecture and more like the fever dream of an emperor who absolutely should not have been trusted with a budget. For a long time, historians suspected theatrical exaggeration. Then excavations in Rome uncovered remains of a circular mechanism that appears designed to rotate using water power and a system of moving parts beneath the floor. In other words, Nero may really have had a first-century spinning restaurant. Not content with luxury, he wanted guests to feel the room itself slowly turning while they dined, because apparently regular decadence no longer delivered enough emotional satisfaction. Once again, an ancient writer described something outrageously excessive. Later people rolled their eyes, and archaeology had to step in and say, no, unfortunately, he really did that. 27. Ancient Chinese accounts describe the tomb of Qin Shi Huang as containing rivers of mercury flowing through a miniature model of his empire, which sounds like exactly the kind of impossible brag a ruler would commission for his own afterlife brochure. Yet soil tests around the emperor's unexcavated burial mound show mercury concentrations far above normal, in some places around 100 times the expected level. That is not the kind of thing you get from wishful thinking. Something inside that tomb is leaking or releasing mercury on a massive scale, which makes those old descriptions suddenly a lot more believable. The chamber itself remains largely unopened because of preservation concerns, and because nobody is especially eager to stroll into a giant ancient toxic hazard for fun. So the first emperor of China may really be lying beneath a landscape threaded with poisonous metal rivers. Even in death, apparently, he insisted on being dramatic. 28. Flood stories appear almost everywhere in ancient tradition, from Noah in the Hebrew Bible to Utnapishtim in Gilgamesh to Manu in Indian tradition, which made skeptics treat them as a universal myth template rather than memory. Then geologists proposed the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, suggesting that around 5600 BCE, Mediterranean waters may have burst into a much smaller freshwater basin and dramatically flooded the surrounding shores. The details are debated, because prehistoric disasters rarely leave behind a tidy signed statement, but large regional floods absolutely happened in the ancient world, and they would have been unforgettable to the people watching their settlements disappear. Survivors scatter, tell their children what happened, add meaning, add gods, add punishment, and eventually you get flood legends so widespread they look symbolic. But the terror underneath them may have been painfully real. Nothing inspires enduring myth quite like seeing the world you know vanish under rising water. 29. Ancient Greek and Egyptian texts referred to Heracleion, also called Thonis, as a major port near the mouth of the Nile, busy, wealthy, and important. Then the city disappeared so completely that later scholars started treating it as either fictional or greatly exaggerated, which is a classic historical mistake right before archaeology gets dramatic. Underwater researchers eventually located the place off the Egyptian coast near Alexandria, sitting on the seabed like a city that had simply forgotten to mention it was underwater now. They recovered temples, giant statues, shipwrecks, inscriptions, coins, and all kinds of urban remains preserved in the sediment. Heracleion had not been invented. It had sunk, likely through a mix of earthquakes, unstable ground, and rising sea levels. So the ancient writers were describing a real port, not fantasizing. The city had just been hiding beneath the Mediterranean for over 1,000 years, waiting for humans to finally look down instead of arguing. 30. Indigenous traditions across the Americas include stories about enormous serpents capable of reshaping the land, and for a long time scientists filed that under mythology because giant monster snakes sounded a little too convenient. Then paleontologists discovered Titanoboa, a prehistoric snake so absurdly large it makes modern pythons look like shoelaces with attitude. This beast lived around 60 million years ago, stretched over 40 feet long, weighed more than a ton, and could absolutely ruin the day of anything unfortunate enough to be nearby, including crocodiles. Now, humans did not coexist with Titanoboa, so nobody was actually out there trading eyewitness accounts of it. But the discovery shattered the lazy assumption that giant serpent imagery must be pure fantasy. Nature had already built snakes on a horrifying scale. Whether later peoples found giant fossils or simply arrived at similar symbols independently, the idea of a truly monstrous serpent was not biologically ridiculous at all. 31. In the Odyssey, sailors face Scylla and Charybdis while passing through a narrow strait, one danger snatching men from the rocks, the other swallowing ships in a deadly whirlpool. On paper, that looks like standard monster storytelling with a strong anti-sailing message. Then you look at the Strait of Messina between Sicily and mainland Italy and realize Homer was not just making up chaos for fun. The waters there are notoriously difficult, with shifting currents and powerful turbulence that could create genuine whirlpools, especially for ancient ships driven by sail and oars. The cliffs and rocky shoreline add caves, shadows, strange noises, and the kind of visual weirdness that a frightened crew would absolutely translate into monsters. So Scylla and Charybdis were not random fantasy creatures dropped into a blank map. They were mythologized versions of a real maritime hazard that ancient sailors experienced as something close to supernatural terror. 32. The Tower of Babel story describes humanity building a tower tall enough to reach heaven, only for God to scramble their languages and scatter them across the earth. The likely real-world inspiration was Itamen-Nenki, a massive Babylonian ziggurat dedicated to Marduk. Ancient descriptions say it rose in multiple terraced levels to around 300 feet, which in the ancient world was less nice building, and more, what exactly are you people doing up there? Archaeological remains confirm the huge foundation in Babylon, showing that the structure was no literary invention. It really existed and would have been one of the most imposing monuments of its age. Just as important, Babylon was an imperial capital filled with laborers, officials, traders, and subjects from many different regions speaking many languages. A giant sky-reaching tower with a multilingual workforce already contains the bones of the Babel legend. The divine punishment part came later. The spectacle was real enough on its own. So after all that, here is the real question. Which ancient legend did we leave out that you think deserves a place on this list, and which one here still sounds too insane for you to fully buy? Drop it in the comments and defend your pick like your reputation depends on it. If you want more history that sounds fake and turns out to be real, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us.